Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel. No, I'm so used to saying Carmel, it's not anymore. It's Pacific Grove, California. The area is so close geographically, it's just a few miles away from the other location where the station was. Give me time and I'll get used to saying Pacific Grove, California. I want to welcome to the World Watchers group the youngest member that I know of, other than the time before birth, and that's Sam in Philadelphia. I understand that the group there that play the tapes and have discussions every week and locate books and articles and study these serious matters have two members of that group have a new baby named Sam, and they brought him to a meeting. And I think that he should get an award as the youngest world watcher that I know of. I'm going to knit him a sweater for Sam because he's starting very young, and I'm sure that he'll grow up to be very bright. His parents are making the effort to learn what's going on in this world in the way that it should be done, studying it and studying the problems and attending these discussion groups and sharing with the information. So, Sam, you're going to get a sweater. Hold on there, kid. I'm proud of you. Now, to some very important matters. I'm going to update the continuation of what I did last week, Watergate 1972 and Watergate 1982. It is my contention that Watergate never stopped. The title was marvelous because it is literally a flooding of material, information, and crimes, and people holding the dike, holding the information back, but it seeps out, and they have to keep making appointments higher up in the power structure that were names we were familiar with at the time John Kennedy was murdered, and then at the time of Watergate, the old team from investigating John Kennedy's death were called in to assist in the investigation of Watergate, particularly Leon Jaworski, but a whole team of people related to the past. And now it's 1982, and Ronald Reagan is using the same people, so we'll update the anniversary of Watergate for a few weeks. Before I do that, I have to spend time on the subject of Edwin Wilson, who was brought home to the United States this week. This is a very important matter. I'll do John Hinckley next week. That verdict just came in a little before the program. I don't want to touch it this evening. We'll take it up next week. Edwin Wilson is a person I've talked about on the air as long as his name has surfaced. It came to attention of people when George or Gary Kurkola and Frank Turple were arrested in New York City in December 1979. With the help of various people in New York City who accumulated the newspapers and the coverage there, more than we got out here, we were able to put a grand script or design plan of these agents going back again to the Kennedy assassination through the entire era with the Bay of Pigs, the anti-Castro Cubans, and this gang was responsible and is responsible for the so-called left terrorism, which is really funded by the CIA and organizing people like Idi Amin and Gaddafi and the PLO, while the United States arms one side, they arm the terrorists. And they've been responsible for, credited for helping Carlos the Jackal and for the Munich Olympic Games where the Israeli athletes were killed in 1972. When Kurkola and Turple were in this country before they left, they were told, Frank Turple was told, get out of the country by the FBI. He used his name, he didn't use an alias. They didn't want them in jail, they didn't want them in this country, so they left. And Edwin Wilson has been over in Europe all this while, and there are a lot of questions to be asked. Why bring him home at this time? But in conjunction with his coming home, there was a little ballet going on last week. I call it the assassination waltz, and the characters were very interesting. One was Edwin Wilson, who was brought home. The other was John Paul II, and of course Ronald Reagan and Raymond Donovan, our Secretary of Labor, who's under a crisis situation right now, and their paths interweave dates and cities in an interesting way. Now, first of all, Ronald Reagan came home from Great Britain and Europe. He was so tired he fell asleep when the Pope was speaking after he went so far to see him. But he kept his commitment to go to Houston, Texas, to promise to raise money for the GOP. And on the news, I heard that he was the one that insisted that the GOP nominations, a convention, be held in Dallas, Texas in 1984. 1984 is a perfect year. It's the year people have feared for the police state. Reagan is insisting that the city where John Kennedy was murdered be the location of the GOP convention. He knows full well that he and Richard Nixon would never have been president of the United States if John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy had not been murdered in order for these people to take over. He knows that. He was on the CIA committee, the commission headed by Nelson Rockefeller, and Ronald Reagan was on that committee in 1975 to investigate the possible CIA links to the murder of John Kennedy. And then they brought in David Bellin from the Warren Commission to cover it up more. These people are not childlike. They know what's going on. And after even being assigned to that committee, I think he only attended 2 meetings, but assigned his name to the conclusions. Ronald Reagan wants a convention down there. So he was in Houston, Texas, but Houston, Texas is a very important city also because Leon Jaworski, who let the men literally off easy at Watergate, most of the people involved, one of the investigators, comes from a CIA group down in Houston, Texas, the Anderson Foundation. And Leon Jaworski covered up the John Kennedy murder, the Korea Gate examination of the crime and payoffs, and the Reverend Moon links to Nazi money. He covered up the Moon connections to the Korea Gate, and then he did the Watergate in between. He's from Houston, Texas, as is the John Hinckley family, as is John Connally, who took a very quiet disappearance after the shooting of Ronald Reagan in Washington a while back, a year and a half ago. John Connally's been very quiet. But it is the location of the real power structure of this country, Houston, Texas, and Gulf Oil and Resources were the organization run by Mr. Allen, who funneled money from overseas into our electoral process, which is absolutely illegal, but it was done. And it's against all the books. And he took money from overseas, CIA money that went to Mexico and came back to Marie Stans, and I'll do more on him in a minute or two, and then went to the committee to re-elect the president, and ended up in the bank of Bernard Barker, a paymaster for the Bay of Pigs, who was funding the men at the Watergate Hotel. So that the illegal funneling for money, a large sum, $68 million, raised to get Richard Nixon in office to re-elected, came a big hunk of it through illegal part and all over the country. As a matter of fact, from Houston, Texas, and as I say, we have John Connally and Leon Jaworski, and Ronald Reagan was down there promising them 40 or 60 million for Dallas that they'd make in franchises having a convention. So he was down in Dallas, and Edwin Wilson was brought in. Earlier this year, while they were trying to get Wilson in, there was a man arrested in New York City. And some very fine world watchers in New York sent me an article from the New York Post that I haven't had time to put on these programs yet, January 29th, 1982, this last January. And a man named John Paul Arthur, who worked with Wilson, Edwin Wilson, and Frank Churchill, was arrested in New York City. He was described in the New York Post as a mystery British hitman linked to Turple and Wilson. And in London, Arthur was also linked to a recruiter, Rocco Salvatore. And Salvatore is also an associate of Churchill and Wilson. He came into New York City, and the detective, William Mulligan, was quoted in the newspaper, "Every time we pick up a rock, we find several more connections." It would take 20 years before Mr. Mulligan would get the connections of Wilson, Churchill, and Corcola. It covers the whole era. Meanwhile, the newspaper said Arthur's mission is a mystery. The police and federal agents want to unravel this tight-lipped gunman. He had a Uzi submachine gun, a high-powered pistol, a miniature pair of field glasses, $1,000 in cash. He was being held on a $1 million bail, interviewed by the FBI, the Secret Service, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The CIA, Interpol also had an interest in the case. Now, you notice there hasn't been a word about him. He had contacts down at Fort Lauderdale, telephone numbers there, and a picture of a co-worker, evidently a Latin American, left at the Holiday Inn at the Kennedy Airport, picked up in Brooklyn the tip. It was an anonymous phone call to the cops. I don't know who the hero is who brought this person in, but an anonymous tip went out to the police, who picked him up. He was on a $1 million bail. But that's the kind of activity that Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple and George Corcola are involved in. And somebody's life was saved, or maybe he's dead already. But they tried, and at least the tip stopped it maybe for a day or two, and then they pulled in another gunman. Well, while Ronald Reagan was in Texas, this is June the 15th or 16th, over those 2 days, Edwin Wilson was brought home on June the 16th, 1982. Now, he's linked to the CIA, to Navy intelligence, to Task Force 157, to the deputy director of the CIA, Bobby Inman, who just resigned, who was the National Security Council chief. He was linked to the highest echelons of government. And before he came home, he stopped in Zurich, Switzerland. Just before he made his trip to the United States, they entrapped him, so-called entrapped him. And I'm not sure they did, looking at the news that happened the same day all over the globe. But anyway, he stopped in Zurich, Switzerland, and picked up $18 million. He was supposed to use it for a small Caribbean island, and we're trying to check out if that was the Dominica island that they tried to overthrow earlier this year, that also involved the name of Robert Vesco and John Connolly, the American Nazi Party, the American Klan, the British Nazi Party, that were to use it for a Fourth Reich center of activities. The Dominica invasion failed, but with 18 million, I'm sure that he could get some people to get a little coup going. He had 18 million in his pocket when he came to New York. He picked it up in Zurich. Now, when he was picked up in Zurich, simultaneously over in Beirut, Lebanon, his headquarters, the Israeli army was entering Beirut. And it doesn't seem that Alexander Haig or Richard Nixon are too embarrassed or angry about that. And centered in Beirut is Yasser Arafat, who may be sacrificed and become more of a martyr if he's killed, or he's sitting over there at the time that Wilson is here in the United States. The person that he funded and trained with money from the CIA and Navy intelligence to Arafat, his buddy is entrapped over there with the Israeli army moving in on Beirut. Simultaneously, the Israeli army captured 3 members of the PLO who were trained by Wilson and Carlos, who assisted in the killing of the Israeli athletes at the Olympic Games in 1972. And also over there, as of June the 8th, was Carlos the Jackal in Beirut, Lebanon. And also, when Edwin Wilson was picked up, he was picked up in Dominican Islands and brought right to the United States. But the weapon that supplied Ajah when he shot the Pope was purchased in Zurich, and the man who got the weapon for Ajah, and I'll get into that in a minute, was arrested this week on just about the same day simultaneously that Edwin Wilson came to the United States. Now, Wilson had pleaded to come to the United States. He was in Rome before and after the Pope was shot, and I believe that his circle was responsible for that shooting, attempted shooting of the Pope, attempted killing the Pope. He was shot. But this Wilson was in Rome with United States officials at that time and right after that, and there were articles about it. He was pleading to turn in 2 Chileans who were responsible for working as a team, of course, for the killing of Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffat in the United States. And he would bring in 2 people. I think I referred to it way back as like a fishing thing. I'll give you 2 Cubans for my life. He hires these teams. He's very high up. So if he's making deals for 2 Cubans, did he go for a big boy? Is he going to turn in Arafat, the 3 PLOs that killed the Israeli athletes? His buddies are over there being bombarded by Israel, and Prime Minister Begin is in this country with the President Alexander Haig, and Wilson is literally home safe in the United States at this time. And being as he's bargained for other people's lives, I just wonder what kind of a deal he's made. Now, John Paul II had an arduous few weeks like Ronald Reagan. He was in Great Britain. That was a long planned trip. That wasn't a quickie. Then he ran down to Argentina, and then he spent 12 hours in Geneva. June the 16th, he's in Geneva. At the time Wilson's brought home, if you can follow me, I'm going pretty fast, the same time Edwin Wilson is brought home, the Pope is in Geneva. Now, in Argentina, there is Licio Gelli. That is the fellow who fled with over $26 million from Italy. He was responsible for the near coup, the fascist coup that was to take place in Italy. He worked with the entire Italian government, and when he fled, the government changed 180 degrees. Jelly fled, but he has direct links to Ronald Reagan, who was down in Texas working out his problems, I suppose. He was at Ronald Reagan's inauguration. He worked closely with Michael Sindona, who's now in jail on murder charges. He's been charged with murdering a judge in Milan, and he's been charged with 45 million missing out of the Franklin National Bank in New York City, and also some Milan banks that are missing several million each. So Jelly is down there in Argentina. The Pope goes to Argentina, and then he flies to Geneva, Switzerland. So that Edwin Wilson was in Zurich, the Pope is in Geneva. It gets a little more complicated. Just wait, we got a good one going here, okay? It gets even more weird. The Pope is in Geneva, and at the time he's in Geneva, Roberta Calvi was missing. Now, he was president of the Banco Ambrosiana, with direct links to Michael Sindona and to the Vatican and to Licio Gelli down there in Argentina. As a matter of fact, he was missing just a couple of days, and he had gone to the Vatican to request funds from Mr. Marcinkus, the head banker, the Archbishop of the Vatican, who's soon to become a cardinal, if you will. He's the treasurer. He's the guy from Cicero, Illinois, that I say he's directly and too close to the old Al Capone gang of Cicero, Illinois. They go, this Pope is now in Geneva, simultaneously when Roberta Calvi, who holds the secret to the Vatican manipulations of money, responsible for up to $200 million of Vatican money, has gone because of Michael Sindona and Mr. Marcinkus, the Archbishop. So Roberta Calvi was missing, and he went to ask Paul Marcinkus in Chicago he's from Chicago. He asked him because he has a special fund. It's called the Institute for Religious Works, and it's described in the San Francisco Examiner as the unofficial bank. He's the head of the unofficial bank for religious works. The San Francisco Sunday Examiner had an article, and you might not have seen it on your wire services. It came from London, that Mr. Calvi tried but failed to secure a loan from the Institute for Religious Works, the Vatican's unofficial bank, whose head is Archbishop Marcinkus. Marcinkus turned him down, and then Mr. Calvi was found. The newspaper said suicide with a question mark. He was hanging off of a bridge in London, this Italian banker. He had $18,000 on him, which hardly sounds like a suicide. You'd leave the money somewhere else, I should think. I think he had the money to flee the country. But he was left there dangling off of a bridge, if you follow this script now, on June the 16th, at the time the Pope is in Geneva. There was an article September 30th, 1981, about the U.S. bishop gets the key job in the Vatican. And it says John Paul II appointed Marcinkus, 59, of Cicero, Illinois, to be the pro-president of the Pontifical Commission of the State of Vatican City. Automatically, it makes him an archbishop. And then the article says that they were surprised that he had this position because when Michael Sindona and the Vatican money and the financial empire collapsed, the Vatican money that was missing was estimated between 46 million and 200 million went with it. So Sindona had 45 million out of the Franklin National Bank, 46 to 200 million, and here is a fellow asking for help from that person who's responsible for the missing money, and it was the one who got 24 million of tax money out of Italy to Argentina. So on the day that he is dead, the Pope has made a quick trip to Geneva. Now, while he's in Geneva, Raymond Donovan is in Geneva, our Secretary of Labor, June the 15th and 16th. He also was in Geneva as supposedly a labor conference, okay? But he was there. And while he's there, the week that he's there, June the 11th, his primary close friend and a witness before a special investigator into Donovan's links to mob was discovered by the Manhattan police in the trunk of a car. That was Fred Farino, former Teamster Union official, and he worked with Secretary of Labor Donovan's offices with his company. He disappeared June the 3rd from his home in Danbury, Connecticut. This person was a close associate of Salvatore Bergoglio, who was murdered in 1975, a few years ago, or 78. It was 78, it couldn't be 75, because he was a suspect in the Jimmy Hoffa murder. And I'm going more into Donovan on the Watergate update, but just because it ties into the Wilson story, he was over in Switzerland the same time the Pope was in the same city. The Pope's primary witness to Vatican hanky-panky is dying in London. A primary witness to Donovan's mob connections is dead in New York. Edwin Wilson is in New York City, and his cohorts in Palestine, the Palestinians, the PLO, working in Beirut, and Carlos and Arafat are in danger of their lives over there. Now, while the Pope is in Geneva, Switzerland, San Francisco Examiner, June the 16th, has an article, no headlines, incidentally. They have an article, the Pope suspect for the shooting was arrested in Bern, Switzerland. And interestingly enough, this was sent to me by somebody in San Francisco, a world watcher. He takes the Examiner, I take the Examiner. It wasn't in my copy. We get different editions. This is June the 16th, 1982. Pope shooting suspect. Bern, Switzerland. Swiss authorities said today they're holding a Turkish national suspected of being involved in the May 13th attempt on Pope John Paul's life. He was the man charged. This man has been charged with supplying the pistol with which the convicted attacker, Mehmet Ali Ajah, shot and seriously wounded the Pope. He is in Bern, Switzerland, and was picked up on June the 16th, the accomplice of the Ajah who shot at the Pope. Now, did Edwin Wilson turn in these people? Incidentally, Gung Ho had an article that the weapon to shoot the Pope was purchased in Zurich, Switzerland. So the weapon to shoot the Pope was from Zurich. Wilson goes to Zurich and picks up $18 million. The man who supplied the gun is now in Bern, and he's brought in, arrested. So that 2 are dead and 1 is arrested, and some PLO have been rounded up that were part of Wilson's team. So Wilson is tucked in the United States safely and may get a little tap on the finger or the insanity charge like John Hinckley. Wilson is home in the United States, and all of these various bodies are strewn all over the world, and it's important because simultaneously in each of these cities where the Pope was, where Donovan was, where Edwin Wilson was, something was happening that affected not only them, but each other, that was related to the other persons, because they were not separate entities, and these people all had direct connecting links. For example, the Sindona story, the Licio Gelli, the Italian P2 scandal was directly and closely related to the Republican committee to re-elect the president. Michael Sindona allegedly wanted to give $1 million, but we don't know whether he did or not because the papers were shredded. But maybe one of the $62 million came from Michael Sindona, taken out of the Vatican prayer shawls and given to Richard Nixon, and then given to Ronald Reagan's election. You know, you can light so many candles and count so many beads, and then they take your money and they give it to these crooks to take your life and your taxes and everything else. Now, Deputy Director Bobby Inman resigned, and a new Deputy Director of the CIA, John McMahon, was approved by the Senate May 28th. That was just 2 weeks before all this came down. He's spent a lifetime with the CIA, and that's important. But the main thing is that he knew that Edwin Wilson was coming home. Kevin McCullough was working on it with the CIA, and Pete Carey from the San Jose Mercury, who did the wonderful work on the Otto von Bolschwing story, was the one who had the San Jose Mercury article about Edwin Wilson picking up $18 million in Zurich. And also the other articles I had said that the gun came from Zurich. So you can put this all together, and I think you will agree that it's interesting, the paths that these people are following from the past to the present, and watching them do their little ballet. I call that the travelers. Now to update the Watergate story for the remainder of these 5 minutes and then the next half hour on the tape and on the broadcast on the air. I was mentioning certain persons last week that were tangled in the early Watergate story. Now I want to talk about current people 10 years later in the White House. Why are they there? What are they doing there? And then throw out some questions to you that honestly, I'm not sure the answer. One has to do with the Wilson conflict, and the other has to do with the labor secretary and the mob around Ronald Reagan, and what do they mean? I have several interpretations, and I'll share those with you. The investigation of Raymond Donovan when he was approved by the Senate was a disgrace. The FBI and the White House knew that he belonged to the crime circles, to La Cosa Nostra, to the Genovese family, to members of organized crime, that he was closely associated with business deals and talked to them on the telephone. They had tapes of the conversations. It was a shocker for the Senate. They believed when they were told that he was cleared, although they're not born yesterday and their age of innocence really should end, 10, 20 years ago. But a Representative Toby Moffett, a Democrat of Connecticut, is introducing a resolution to inquire into the White House and Department of Justice and get their documents and memorandums and records of the FBI investigation of Donovan. And the FBI, incidentally, is run by Mr. Webster, appointed by Jimmy Carter, who is up to his neck in the mob in Atlanta, Georgia, the narcotics dealing. When Jimmy Carter was running for president and Ronald Reagan was president, I said it's two mob bosses fighting for the turf. William Webster covered up the drugs in Jonestown. That alone is scandalous. It's horrendous. William Webster has covered up the links of Billy Carter to Gaddafi, to Carlos Marcello, to the meeting of these people, to Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple for the use of narcotics, for bringing and transferring weapons. The sale of narcotics in and out of Atlanta, Georgia is scandalous. Webster was appointed by Jimmy Carter. So that there's no change here in attitudes of getting these people or opening up investigations. But Mr. Moffett, Representative Moffett, he said in the newspaper this week that he's concerned that the White House may have interfered in the investigation in the way that former Richard Nixon attempted to shut off the FBI probe of the Watergate break-in. Senator Byrd called for Donovan to step aside, and the special prosecutor was to discuss with them, Mr. Leon Silverman, what happened when Fred Farino was murdered, because he had already called him in as a witness when he was murdered in New York City, this Teamster official. So Congress is going to get angrier about the fact that when they confirm somebody, that both the White House and both the FBI, well, it's not both, it's three, the Justice Department entirely, the FBI or the Narcotics Division, and the Criminal Division or the possible Criminal Division in the White House, know that their appointments are not clean, and they tell the FBI to tell the Senate they are, and then the Senate passes on these people, and eventually, when the truth comes out, it makes the Senate look silly, but they should have known they weren't working with babies. Now, Watergate, as I say, isn't over yet. Mary McCrory had an article this week on the musings of Archibald Cox and the people involved in Watergate that are still in power today, but I'm going to go one step further. And the step I'm going to take, I think I'll start on the second half of this tape, is with that character, Fred Fielding, who played such an important role in hushing up the Watergate story. He played an important role in telling the FBI Labor Secretary Donovan was clean, knowing he wasn't, and he played a role in telling the FBI in the United States that Richard Allen was clean, knowing he wasn't. So then you have to go back, who's Fred Fielding? Military intelligence, counterintelligence, or disinformation, and also the horrendous role he played in Watergate that I briefly mentioned last week. We'll take a 1-minute break and turn over our tapes, and then I'll go back to Fred Fielding and what is going on in the White House, that they're pushing appointments that they know are tainted to organized crime. This is side 2 of broadcast number 550, June 21st, 1982. Now, Fred Fielding was directly involved to the matters I discussed last week on the anniversary of the Watergate arrest 10 years later. Fred Fielding was called in by John Dean, the attorney in the White House, to clean out the desk files of E. Howard Hunt. Now, those were the most important files. How E. Howard Hunt had been with the CIA at least 18 years. He was involved in counterintelligence with the Bay of Pigs activity. With his wife was the head of the CIA group over in Spain in Madrid. He had an entire lifetime career of intelligence, but more important than just gathering information, he was doing disinformation and counterintelligence. And in his desk, not only did he have a pistol, but he had information on the Chappaquiddick affair, and I'm sure it was to be used to blackmail Senator Ted Kennedy, because later Tony Lasowitz was up at the island. It turned out the night Mary Jo Kopechne died. Fred Fielding was brought in to destroy the records of the ITT scandal. ITT had given $400,000 to the Nixon campaign to settle a merger dispute with the Justice Department. That was to be part of their campaign contributions. He was there to get rid of and destroy the forging of the State Department papers on the murder of DM, blaming John Kennedy for the murder. So these offices of the ITT were directly linked to many of the Nazi connections I talk about every week, but the assassinations, the forgeries, blaming a dead president for somebody's murder, the ITT, all that was removed by Fred Fielding 10 years ago. And then when Ronald Reagan became president 10 years later, he brought Fred Fielding in as the counsel to the White House again. Now, when you're starting new, you're almost 72 years old, you've waited all your life to be president, why do you bring in that same person one more time to help you? Obviously, to keep cover on what happened before. January the 11th, 1981, Fred Fielding told the FBI that Raymond Donovan was cleared, that don't go into the investigation of crime figures at the hearing, he told them. And he knew of his links, as well as did the third under Webster in the FBI, Mr. Mullen. They knew of these connections, and the second, as far as that goes, and the links to the Genovese family in New York City. And the Genovese family was important because Tony Genovese was with Jack Ruby and an Army colonel, and Nancy Perrin, rich down in Dallas, Texas, just before the assassination of John Kennedy. So the Genovese family goes back 10 years to Jack Ruby and the military and the murder of John Kennedy and Officer Tippit, and the money came from California for Nancy to come from New England and work in this operation and contact Officer Tippit before she came to Texas. We'll get into that a little bit, but Fred Fielding was saying to them, don't go into the connections of Mr. Donovan. He called Mr. Webster January the 11th, 1981. This is in the New York Times. And as a result, on January the 12th, the hearings were held, the Senate committee hearings on Labor and Human Resources on the approval of Mr. Donovan. And on February the 4th, he was sworn in as the Secretary of Labor, even though Mr. Webster and the FBI knew that he was linked to William Maselli, and Maselli was later charged, he's in jail now, for truck charges, hijacking charges, and also for conspiracy to manufacture synthetic cocaine. Now, Ronald Reagan's wife is great on the drug thing now. She's wanting to work with the drug scene. Okay, we'll tell her to just go look at the cabinet. I mean, start with Frank Sinatra and work down. But Donovan's close contact that he was on the telephone with a lot of the time and knew socially and worked business with was William P. Maselli of the Genovese family in New York City. And Maselli was manufacturing cocaine, and the FBI knew it, in addition to other links that he had to La Cosa Nostra and the Lucchese family and so forth. Now, February the 4th, Donovan was sworn in 1981 when President Reagan was in office, as soon as he was inaugurated. And then in a little bit later, starting in January 27th, 1981, Fred Fielding was clearing National Security Council Richard Allen after Reagan was inaugurated, and there was an investigation in November, not in January, pardon me, in November of 1981 on Richard Allen and the scandal of his having, was it $1,000 or $100,000 in his desk, and the links to the photographs of the president's wife at the time of inauguration and with the Japanese officials he'd worked with at Stanford University, and in all of the Japanese mafia and the industrialists and Richard Allen's connections. It was Fred Fielding, Fred F. Fielding, whose office reviewed the personal finances of Richard Allen and told the FBI on November the 13th, Richard Allen is clear. So he had cleared Donovan earlier, he cleared Allen, and he didn't tell the committee that he was a partner in real estate with Richard Allen. And Richard Allen was in business starting in 1972 with Robert Vesco, trying to invest money of Robert Vesco. And talk about the Vatican missing money. Vesco had $214 million from investment overseas and becomes a business partner with a man from military intelligence. And Richard Allen got a condominium that I mentioned a while back on programs with Fred Fielding. So the man who was clearing him was his partner down there in Florida. And then they had a third apartment that they've never disclosed who used it. And I'm sure with their activities, it's a large safe house. Now, a while back, November 28th, last year, 1981, the Los Angeles Times had a story, and one of the tapes that I quoted, it said the Allen investigation will enter the final stage when the American investigators find out what the big present was. The FBI never identified it. The FBI didn't care. The newspaper passed it up, but we have yet to know what the big present was. Well, Richard Allen was moved out of office, but Fred Fielding was telling the FBI in November and calling them and saying, my buddy, Richard Allen, he didn't refer to him as my buddy or his partner or as a business associate in property in Florida, he's cleared. So who is Fred Fielding from military intelligence who gets placed into a position where he destroys counterintelligence assassination activity for Richard Nixon? He covers up the mob connections to the labor secretary when the labor secretary's family and mob family contacts have direct links again back to Dallas and to Jack Ruby. And then he covers up Richard Allen with his connections all around the world with Robert Vesco and organized crime and the syndicate. So Fred Fielding is very important. Why did Ronald Reagan appoint him? Obviously for this role, but why does he have to continue covering up for the past administration? Well, the answer is very obvious if you study the course of history the last 10 years, but there's one article that came out at the time of the BRI-Lab, that's bribery of labor, that was hushed up, just as the ab scam was hushed up as being a minor thing. June 19th, 1980, Joseph Hauser was a witness against Carlos Marcello and Irv Davidson, and Hauser's attorney was Henry Rothblatt, the attorney of all the Watergate defendants when they were first arrested, and the attorney for Bernard Barker, the banker of the Watergate affair, who got his money from the committee to reelect the president, and it came from Mexico and overseas money and illegal money through Mr. Allen and Gulf Resources down in Houston. Rothblatt became the attorney for Joseph Hauser, and Hauser describes his activities in California, how he made his money. He says it wasn't very easy. At the time that he got involved with a lot of obvious criminal activities, he had a $750,000 home in Beverly Hills, and he was a close associate of, as I say, Carlos Marcello. He worked with Irv Davidson. Hauser, according to the Washington Post, 1980, June 19th, said Hauser made a fortune from scandal-ridden California prepaid health plans, which were introduced by then-Governor Ronald Reagan to shift the coverage to private enterprise to save state money. Does that sound a little familiar? Is this what we have again? Reagan is always wanting to save us money, right? So we have Mr. Hauser linked to Ronald Reagan when he was the governor of California with the attorney Rothblatt, who is the attorney for the Watergate defendants. And the beat goes on and on. You see what I mean of the links going back through the years. Now, Mr. Davidson was indicted along with Carlos Marcello in the BRI-Lab, but he's part of the National Security Council and threatened again to blow the case wide open, just as James McCord threatened and E. Howard Hunt threatened at the time of Watergate. He made overt threats when he was arrested, and of course he was released. and he said he does important work for the government and the National Security Council, and he couldn't be intimidated in this way. Now, the Washington Post article tells about Mr. Irv Davidson and how Hauser wanted 185,000 members of the Teamsters Union with accident and health insurance, and he would collect annual premiums of $7 million. He misappropriated that $7 million. You see how much these missing millions came into these scenes. And to help handle the situation, he met Irv Davidson in Washington, D.C., who worked with Carlos Marcello, a lobbyist, a public relations man for Indonesia, for the Israeli Air Force, interestingly enough, and for Mr. Somoza. And Davidson and his friend Thomas Webb, Hauser's friend, took them to call Attorney General Richard Kleindienst, who just got his law degree removed and some more slaps for the Brylab case last week. And they went to the Burning Tree Country Club in Maryland with President Frank Fitzsimmons, the head of the Teamsters. Now, Jimmy Hoffa was released by Richard Nixon, and then he was murdered, and two of the people involved with his murder are close associates of Secretary of Labor Raymond Donovan. So going back to 1980, you have Richard Nixon assisting this crook Hauser. Hauser's attorney is Rothblatt, who's the Watergate defendants' attorneys and the money bag defendants' attorneys, because they were responsible for the shifting sands of money. And then you have the web that goes on to Washington to Irv Davidson and Kleindienst and brings in their golf partner Fitzsimmons. And of course, all the Teamster money went to Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. And when it's misappropriated, you don't get too many headlines. But that is another scale going back to Watergate, with Rothblatt being the attorney, and then he's the attorney for Hauser just currently, and Hauser's association with Carlos Marcello and Irv Davidson. Now, why in the world would Ronald Reagan take in Richard Allen, his close association, known association with Robert Vesco, with the missing $214 million? Why would he take Fielding with his role in the Watergate for destruction of evidence? What was his reason of making these appointments? Of course, they're obvious. Either they have to keep holding the dike, or simultaneously Ronald Reagan owes his presidency to these crime figures, so he has to sink with them or swim with them or whatever the case may be, because he's so much involved in their scandals right up to the hilt. He's been involved with them all along. Richard Allen, as I mentioned way back, was with Army Intelligence. He worked closely with John Dean, with Fred Fielding, and he also was the man who put up a large sum of money to begin the Georgetown policies there, the studies and the think tank there that harbored and released Nazis, and he brought this money over from Germany. He was in Germany, where he said he got his doctor's degree, and he didn't get his degree, but he was the founder, 1962 to 66, of the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies. I have a bio on him going back, it's tape 523, December 13th, 1981, if you want to look it up, or if you don't have it, of Richard Allen's connections to Munich, Germany, and coming back with this large amount of money, first going to Georgia and then up to the Center for Strategic Studies. So Fielding and Allen are close, and Ronald Reagan seemed to have the need to bring these characters into his cabinet at this time. Now, was it important to bring in Raymond Donovan because of possible connections to the Genovese family? How important is that to Ronald Reagan's career, along with Hauser and Marcello and these people? There was an article, an editorial in the San Jose Mercury this last week. It's dated May 28th. It was 2 weeks ago, almost 1982, said, "It's time for Ray Donovan to go." This was several weeks ago. I'm sorry. It says, as Senator Hatch says, someone in Donovan's shoes should be moving heaven and earth to disprove the allegations. Instead, the secretary and his firm only have managed to increase the heat and power of the allegations. In addition to the dead fish smell generated by the counter-investigation launched by his firm, there is an odor rising from the news that Donovan received between $65,000 and $150,000 in short-term interest-free loans from his Chiavone Construction while he was Secretary of Labor. The money was pouring in. Now, the editorial says it's not only the company he keeps, the Chiavone, Shiavone construction company, but a sampling. This isn't all of them, but the sampling of the acquaintances included convicted felon Pellegrino Billy Maselli, a soldier in the Genovese crime family, Anthony Tony Provenzano, the Teamsters leader in New Jersey, and this editorial doesn't even say that he was the stepson of Jimmy Hoffa, and with him the day he died, and a suspect in the murder. Big Sam Cavalieri of the Lucchese mob, and the late labor racketeer Salvatore Sally Bugs Bergoglio, a reported mafia hitman, and a suspect in the disappearance and murder of Jimmy Hoffa. He was gunned down in New York. It was 1978. That's right. That in Little Italy in New York. So that two people involved with the Hoffa murder and are tied up to friends of Donovan and with Donovan's construction company. And Hoffa and the Teamster money was a very important part of the Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan administration. So that Donovan had those links. I mean, that was a May 28th article, and there are even more articles now of the La Cosa Nostra, the Luccheses, the Genoveses. Hardly the only one left out of this is the Gambinos, and that's the Vatican. The Vatican, Michael Sindona has been linked to the Gambino family and the Secretary of the Treasury, David Kennedy, I mentioned before. Those are the links to Italy to the Gambino family. So you've got it, the Cosa Nostra, the Luccheses, the Genoveses, and the Gambinos. There's not many families left. And so for the President of the United States to pull these people in, did he owe them a debt of getting him to be president, and with Frank Sinatra, of course, walking in and out of the White House and carrying messages to New York City and so forth for the president's wife at the present time? What is going on? Another appointment that Ronald Reagan made that was rescinded just this week was even more sinister or dangerous. We have his appointment of Fred Fielding from Watergate and Richard Allen. He appointed as a head of the Drug Enforcement Agency a man who has been investigating Raymond Donovan and cleared him. His name is Francis M. Mullen. In the Washington Post, July the 11th, 1982, page A7 says, it doesn't use the word even, I put that in, Senator Strom Thurmond, shelved the nomination of the FBI's Francis M. Sullivan, Jr., as head of the Drug Enforcement Administration in light of complaints of the FBI investigation last year of Secretary of Labor Raymond Donovan. He was supposed to be made the head of the Drug Enforcement Agency. Mullen was defending his role in the FBI. He is still one of the FBI's 3 executive assistant directors, as well as the acting DEA administrator. Imagine him as a DEA administrator. He supervised the FBI background investigation of Donovan's qualifications as a cabinet appointment. And last week it was compounded when he acknowledged, and this is in the Washington Post, that he knew Donovan's name was mentioned on the organized crime wiretaps when they were arresting Maselli or wanted to arrest him, on making synthetic heroin and so forth in laboratories, and Donovan's name is on there, and this is the deputy of the DEA who is going to become the director of the DEA. Mullen defended his action, now listen to this, on grounds that the conversation which suggested possible social ties between Donovan and the reputed members of the Genovese family of the Mafia was not pertinent to the Senate Donovan inquiry. He said he didn't want to open up the underlying organized crime investigation and its 1,600 hours of tape recordings to the Senate scrutiny. So even though he knew all this, he gets promoted to the director, although it was pulled out this week and rescinded, to be the head of the Drug Enforcement Agency, knowing the close links on many hours, the 16 hours of tape. Don't mention Donovan once. And the Senate is asking for these tapes. They tried to cover this up, And the important thing is that they had a lot more information, much more information, including a trip to Miami with Maselli, Mr. Donovan, in 1979 to the Super Bowl. I'll do more later on the Super Bowl, probably next week, but it was at the Super Bowl where Carlos Marcello and Irv Davidson and Billy Carter were meeting. And Carter worked with Edwin Wilson, the character who just came home. Wilson isn't apart from all this. This is not separate from the Edwin Wilson I was talking about, the traveling salesman and so forth, when the tape started. Now, another appointment Ronald Reagan made on his cabinet, and I'm not even going this week into the Nazi connections. We've done J. Peter Crace, and I could do 20 Nazi connections. An important appointment was Maurice Stans that he made. It was December the 4th, 1981. Stans was picked for a job as director of Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC. That means if you have Anaconda Copper and Pinochet's kicked out and the copper is nationalized, you and I, the taxpayers, have to pay back and guarantee what was taken to the people who had it and stole it in the first place. They stole it at no cost and took these resources, and the investment overseas will be protected. Now, Maurice Stans was the head of the committee to re-elect the president. He raised $62 million, and I got some very good articles on them, and one from another world watcher in the Midwest who sent it to me. He worked with Donald Nixon, with John Mitchell, with Bernie Cornfield, when that $214 million was missing from investment overseas. Maurice Stans gets a presidential appointment after the committee to re-elect the president was so much part of the Watergate scandal. I just took out of a Watergate book, and I have about 80 on the subject, just some brief descriptions. One, Who's Who in Watergate. I'll read you the biography of just 2-3 people. One was Robert Allen, president of Gulf Oil, and this relates to Maurice Stans, who just got this appointment. Okay, or got it the first of the year. President of Gulf Oil and Resources from Houston, Texas, Republican campaign finance director for Texas. He funneled funds across the border, laundered them in Mexico banks, delivered them to Maurice Stans, the new appointee. Okay, I say new because it's this year. Whence they end up in Miami, account of Bernard Barker. Mr. Allen didn't think he did anything wrong, even though corporate and foreign donations are expressly illegal. Now, anytime you get tapped for the law, you can't say, I didn't think I did something wrong. You didn't see Mr. Robert Allen go to jail for this, and you didn't see Maurice Stans go to jail. They got an appointment. They got rewarded. Okay? It came through Maurice Stans. Dwayne Andreas, the millionaire soybean king, funneled money to Stans, trying to beat or cheat the contribution reporting deadline last year. Afterwards, he was mysteriously awarded a federal charter for a bank. Okay, it went through Maurice Stans. Alfred Baldwin III, an FBI agent, rented a room at the Holiday Inn across from the Democratic headquarters in Washington, D.C. He tape recorded everything that went on to the opposing party, the Republicans and the Democrats. He tape recorded those rooms, took those recordings, and delivered them to the committee to re-elect the president. He was granted immunity, but he took them to Maurice Stans. In other words, Fielding was covering up the DM papers, the ITT, the Chappaquiddick, and the major scandals. The person who was taping the headquarters returned them to Mr. Stans. Stans had his shredders going, the gemstone files, the gemstone papers, the money, who contributed, links possibly to the Vatican, to people who are now in jail for swindles and murders, and covering all that up. And he gets an appointment. And Bernard Barker, a Cuban, another description, who received his money from Maurice Stans, and Mr. Andreas, who works in Miami, and he told the Watergate judge he didn't know where the money came from, but he was a close business associate of B.B. Rebozo, President Nixon's closest friend and confidant, so that the money goes from Maurice Stans down to Bernard Barker, and Rebozo's helping Richard Nixon get elected. And it also went, John Caulfield got money from the committee to re-elect the president. He was the man who was threatening to kill James McCord. He was brought in for Ehrlichman's dirty work. Did you see Caulfield go to jail? No. New York police, hired by Ehrlichman for domestic affairs, was paid by Maurice Stans, and he originally hired James McCord. Now that gets into the question of if McCord was getting Richard Nixon out of office to make way, say, for Jerry Ford and Nelson Rockefeller, and then eventually for Ronald Reagan, and the money came out from the committee to reelect the president again, it brings me to a question that I have to ask about these particular people that I want to pose to you. When Edwin Wilson was brought home this last week, was he brought home because he's offering immunity? He'll get immunity for bringing in some corpses overseas and around the world that are embarrassing these people that have to be out of the way. Did he set up their murder to get immunity? Was Edwin Wilson brought home because Ronald Reagan wants him to talk for immunity over here and bring in people like George Bush and the FBI, Bush directly involved with the Tellier, Ronnie, Moffat murders, the Mubarak, Sadat crisis? Edwin Wilson and Thomas Kleins had their offices in Switzerland. Remember the famous offices that were set up, Tursam, for the murder, sending money to the PLO, the murder of Sadat, and going into the Mubarak. Wilson is linked to Bush, to Inman, to CIA. He's linked to the Nuganan people, Nuganan Bank, where 12 people have been murdered. Does he know he'll be murdered if he doesn't come home? Did he let himself come home and wasn't baited by $18 million? Was Wilson home because he's going to bring down that element of the government that has been involved in so much? And is this Ronald Reagan's been so quiet about the Hinckley family? Is this Reagan's way of pulling out the CIA element that tried to kill him for George Bush? Or did George Bush send in his campaign advisor, his head henchman from Houston, Texas, again, Mr. Baker, who's chief of staff, to coax I keep confusing Nixon and Reagan, they're so much alike, to coax Ronald Reagan to take mob figures on his cabinet so that he could be discredited later and not seem credible? I truly don't know which way it's going to fall, but their heads are bumbling together now. I know that there's a lot of conflict. I know by the cities they were in. I know by the people that are arrested. I know with Wilson coming home. There's a lot going on behind the scenes. But Ronald Reagan made these appointments, and they're all known links not only to the crime, but back to the John Kennedy murder and the Watergate. So how far can Reagan hold the line, or will he slide out and the CIA take over with Bush coming in if too many mobsters get linked to his administration? Time will tell how many chips follow, what domino is going to force the other one down, or whether they're going to fight each other. But it's very important to realize that while they're celebrating the birth of the Prince of Wales and all these happy events that are taking place, or watching the Israelis slaughter maybe 11,000 women and children in Lebanon, there are other things going on that are very important to the power structure. So we'll watch it carefully. I'll be back with you next week, and this is Mae Brussell in Pacific Grove, California.